Today we're sending messages, photographs, documents, and files without wires. We're just sending them through the air like a magic vapor. Who would have believed it from then to now? This morning we'd like to welcome John to the Common Ground stage. He'll be drawing on his experience as a telegraph officer in a time when the CPR station was Kenora's communication hub. Please come in. John Bowiec. Let's welcome John Bowiec to the stage.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to Dorothea and her assistants for having given me the privilege to talk to you today about the life and times of a CPR station agent and telegraph operator. My story begins in 1951. I was a university student going to St. Paul's in Winnipeg, and I decided that the expense of the tuition, the cost of providing for my education, was something that my father couldn't handle. He was a section man, and he didn't make a lot of money. He had to provide for his own needs. So I talked to Daddy, and I asked him whether he would approach Ernie Howland, who at that time was the station agent in Rennie, and ask him whether he would take me on as an apprentice to learn the trade. My father used to do some barbering on the side, and so Ernie Howland was one of his customers. So Ernie said yes. He says, I'll take him on. So from that time in January until May the 18th, 1952, I was apprenticed to Ernie Howland and eventually learned the trade and started as a telegraph operator on May 18th in 1952. It was quite an exciting time for me. I had just turned 19, and here I was making $235 a month. Pretty good wage for a kid of 19. So that career spanned a period of about 8 years, and I'll tell you why it was so brief. But I'll take you back to 1838. 1838 was the year that Samuel Morse invented the Morse telegraph. He strung a line between Washington Station and the Baltimore Railway Station, and he sent 4 words. And the 4 words were, "What hath God wrought?" That was a quotation from the Bible, from the book of Numbers, and I guess maybe Sammy thought he had some divine inspiration because those are the words that he used to describe the first message. It was the railway code was not really, the Morse code was not really introduced into the operation of trains for quite a period of time, perhaps 10 or more years. And in 1851, the general superintendent for the Erie and Eastern Railroad was our passenger on the train. And at that time, trains were run on what was known as an interval of time. The conductor would be provided with some sort of a talisman, maybe a flag or something. And that was his authority to occupy a section of track for a period of time, limited time, maybe an hour, 2 hours, or whatever. When the 2 hours, he advanced the train, but when the 2 hours had expired, if that was the period of time that he was entitled to occupy the track, he would have to remove the train from this main line and occupy a siding. Now, this general superintendent was a passenger on the train, and so he went to the telegraph office and he said to the telegrapher, send a telegram to the station ahead to see whether the train that we're to meet has arrived there yet. When he was informed that it had not, he issued an instruction And the instruction was that that train was not to go beyond that point until the arrival of his train. He went back to the conductor, explained what he had done. The conductor says, well, you're the general superintendent. I guess we do as you say. However, the engineer balked. He said, no, it's a violation of the rules. Can't go into that track. We're not authorized to. So he said, move over. He was an experienced engineman, so he took the train to the next station. And so thus, this first train order was issued, 1851, and at a place called Harrison, New York, they have erected a monument commemorating that particular event. And so, as it happened, with the introduction, with the effectiveness of, seeing the effectiveness of Morse code, stations were created along the line. Agents were employed. Telegraph operators were employed. And they hired train dispatchers who then were located at a central point and could issue train orders so that trains would be directed and managed in accordance with the dispatcher's instructions. So that's the position of a station agent was born. Now, the station agent was central to a community. He was always highly respected, probably very well educated, and he had to assume responsibilities for many other things besides issuing train orders and directions and messages to trains. He had to be the baggage master. He had to be familiar with freight tariffs, express tariffs. He sent and received telegrams, so he had to know something about telegram services. And he was also the only person in town that had the correct time. Now, the reason for that is interesting. In Canada, from coast to coast, at exactly 6 minutes to 11 in the morning in our time zone, the wire would be opened. The telegraph wire would be open. Nobody could use it for 1 minute. When that moment of silence had elapsed, there would be a long dash. And when that dash commenced, it was exactly 5 minutes to 11. So all the railroad personnel were able to adjust their timepieces to that. But that was only because the station agent would then take a look at the clock, and he had a clock card mounted inside the window where the pendulum swung, and it would have a variation of 10 seconds. 10 seconds slow, 10 seconds fast, but somewhere in between that particular station card, or that clock card would be adjusted. So that meant that you didn't have to adjust the pendulum every day to the correct time. So that was a kind of a interesting aspect to the responsibilities. I mentioned the fact that the station agent was responsible for billing. It's interesting that Whitemouth, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the location of that community. It is the most easterly station on the CPR that had a grain elevator. Grain elevators are not as distinguishable today as they used to be. Every branch line, every depot on a branch line had more than one particular grain elevator. But the station agent was responsible for billing freight loads of grain to Fort William, where the major grain elevators were located. But on the other side of Kenora, most of the stuff was lumber, that sort of thing, pulpwood, paper, and so that's what most of the billings were from here. When I was living in Rennie as a young boy, Number 2, which was a daily passenger train, would arrive at about noon. The express truck, platform truck, would be removed from the freight shed, and it would be placed on the platform, and it would be spotted next to the express car door. And a lot of people would help the agent unload the express. And many of the parcels that were unloaded from the express car were merchandise parcels from places like the Teton Company, the Robert Simpson Company. These were major mail order houses that were located in Winnipeg and Regina. And I'm sure that many of you seated here today will remember the Eatons and the Simpsons catalogs. They always adorned a favorite spot in the house. And many of us would review the articles, the beautiful articles, be they apparel or whatever, that were depicted on the pages of the catalog that we couldn't afford. Nevertheless, ladies would prepare orders that they would send to Eaton's, and they would go to the express office, to the station's office, and he would then issue a money order for the purchase of the merchandise. That would be inserted in the envelope, of course, and dispatched to the Teton Company for fulfillment. And it's interesting that these orders were frequent. The post office didn't carry much in the way of parcel stuff in those days. They are mostly mail, catalogs, and whatever. But the express was generally a responsibility of the railroads. And of course, the express business declined in the 1950s because passenger trains were becoming less frequent. The trucking industry was starting to make its mark. People like Rudy Crow and Jack Edwards were big operators in the trucking industry, and were hauling merchandise from Winnipeg to Kenora. Prior to that, we had an express office which was located on the other side of the station, on the east end of the platform, not far from the lunch counter. And they would employ as many as maybe 10, 12 people. And often an express car would come in, it wouldn't be unloaded, it would be spotted at the express station door, and the merchandise would be unloaded. And some of the names that I still remember from the express office were people like Mr. Bowiec. I don't know whether anybody here would relate to that name. He was the chief cashier. Joe Roy, Grant Green, Ronnie Poirier. Those were the few of the names of the people that were involved in managing the express office. One early morning in 53, I think it was 53, I was a passenger on a freight train. I was going to Reading to visit my folks. And I was stopped by a railway policeman. His name was Fred Wheatland. And he asked me who I was, and I told him. I explained why I was there and where I was going. And he said to me, "There's a message for you at the yard office. You're to call the chief dispatcher immediately when they can locate you." And so he said, "You better get to the yard office and phone the chief dispatcher," which I did. And he said to me, "Johnny," he said, "we have arranged a room for you at the Lake of the Woods Hotel. You are to report to the train dispatcher's office at 4:30 in the morning, and you are to work with Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, and Winnipeg." I said, "What?" I said, "I'm not trained for that." But I had purchased a Smith Corona typewriter in my earlier years of working, and taught myself to touch type, and I also taught myself to copy the telegraph on a typewriter. Most operators didn't do that. They wrote train orders and messages out in handwritten script. I guess Mr. Lawson found that out. So anyway, I did the did the assignment. I completed the assignment and carried on with my regular work. And it wasn't long after that Mr. Lawson called me and invited me to work in the superintendent's office as his personal operator, which is quite an honor. Not only that, but I had Saturday and Sunday off. Not only that, but I was getting all kinds of overtime. So I was making quite a lot of money. So some of the people that were employed in the superintendent's office at that time were Ani Ramberg. He was a Lakeside resident. He was the assistant chief clerk. Phil O'Brien was the chief clerk. And, of course, there was quite a number of stenographers that worked there. There might have been 10, 15 stenographers that worked there. And as a matter of fact, I can tell you that Ruth worked there. And that's where we first met. I continued to work there for a period of about 4 or 5 years. And the CPR was not without incident. One afternoon, it was July the 17th, 1954, we lost all communication with the West. We knew that something dramatically wrong had occurred. And no telegram, no phone, no data. We called the wire chief downstairs. He said, I have no explanation for it. It turned out that the Campers Special, which is a passenger extra, which we ran out of Winnipeg, every weekend from June to September, it would come out of Winnipeg, depart Winnipeg on Fridays and return on Sundays. And that train had the unfortunate incident of having derailed at a place called Dagereau, mileage 39.8 on the Keewatin sub. Fred Kirby was the conductor. Each train was supplied with emergency phone. And he took the phone, and there were huge sticks because in the timetable, it depicted the 2 pairs of wires that were required to be connected to in order to talk to the train dispatcher if you had an incident like this take place somewhere in an uninhabited area. And so he connected his phone and talked to the wire chief in Winnipeg. He couldn't talk to us, of course, because he was on the west end of the mishap. My wire chief in Winnipeg arranged a patch from Minneapolis to Chicago to Detroit to Toronto, and thence the CPR network back to us. So here's the conductor of the train, 39 miles from Kenora, talking to us via that route. So immediately, of course, emergency action took place. The hook was called out. Ambulances were called. The tragedy is that 2 people actually died as a result of it. One was Jimmy Zabel. He was the baggage man, and the engine and the tender and the baggage car went in one direction across the westbound main line, and the coaches went the other way. Thank God for that, because there could have been a telescopic effect, and who knows what the casualty numbers may have been. So that was a kind of one of the incidents that I recall in the CPR, which is rather tragic. In 1957, Ruth and I were married, and Mr. Lawson said to me, Johnny, he says, I can't protect you anymore. He said, I've been promoted to the position of superintendent of transportation in Winnipeg. So he said, I would advise you to perhaps look for other work, like bid another job in. And so I bid a job in at Portage la Prairie. I worked there for 13 months as a telegraph operator. Ruth and I lived in a 2-room flat on Queen, I think it was Queen Street. And it was rather a desperate situation because the facilities that were provided by the flat were minimal. And I remember Ruth washing dishes in a dishpan in the tub and cooking on a hot plate because that was all that was available. But nevertheless, we subsequently left Hawk Lake, or at least Portage la Prairie, to go to Hawk Lake. And at Hawk Lake is where I had bid in a job as a station agent. It was a bonanza day for the North End Furniture Company in Winnipeg because we went to Winnipeg and we purchased brand new furnishings, a Chesterfield suite, kitchen and tables, a bedroom suite, a new stove, a new refrigerator, and it was a hallelujah day when the boxcar arrived at Hawk Lake and the sectionman unloaded all these brand new appliances to be put into the station. I was there from October of 1958 until June the 4th. One of the purposes that the station was continued to be active was because there was a company from Winnipeg that was involved in crushing ballast for the CPR. And each day there would be as many as 40 cars of ballast that would be crushed and taken to wherever the ballast was required for the CPR roadbed. Albert Bishop was the engineer on the last steam engine that I saw on the Kenora Division, and that was dispatched from Kenora to Hawk Lake each morning with a trainload of empties, and then he'd pick up the load, switch the yard, and return to Kenora. Our time in Hawk Lake was a pleasant one, I think. We had a child at that time. I remember that the rates that were assessed to me for the occupancy of the depot, that is to say the living quarters of the depot, would get this, $5 a month. The station, the CPR in its generosity gave me back $3 a month for sweeping the waiting room floor because I had to act as janitor. The cost of appliances was 50 cents an appliance. So each appliance we had, such as a stove, fridge, etc., 50 cents a month. So my total cost for the living in the station was in the neighborhood of $8 to $10 a month. So it was a pretty lucrative job because when I had left the railroad to move to Kenora, we had sufficient money to place down as a down payment on a home. So that was rather fortunate. It was in probably May, perhaps April of 1960. I was sitting at my station desk, and an eastbound freight was going by. And it's just amazing how fate can dictate your life. And I say that because the conductor threw off a roll of newspapers, and in reviewing the contents of the newspapers, the minor news, there was a position advertised for a regional representative for the Ontario Hospital Services Commission. Now, some of you here may remember that in 1959, the Ontario government, under the auspices, arm's length, Ontario Hospital Services Commission, introduced the health insurance system. Hospitalization only. $2.10 and $4.20 a month were the initial premiums that were paid to subscribe to necessary health, that is to say, health care in a hospital. So I took it upon myself to apply for this job, and I was invited to come to Kenora to attend to an interview, and a man by the name of Paul Meehan interviewed me. And he said to me, John, he said, how much money are you earning at this point in time? Well, I said, I filed my 1959 income tax return. I think I was around 6,000. He said, what? I said, yeah, 6,000. I said, is that, what's wrong with that? Well, he said, I don't make that much money. He said, you're going to be employed for $3,030 a year. I said, well, he said, how will you ever manage that? I said, I'll get by. He said, you will? I said, yeah. I said, I have a frugal wife. So anyway, that was the end of my career as a station agent. I went to Toronto, and I took some training. I was there for about 4 or 5 weeks. In the meantime, we had purchased a home in Kenora, and Ruth had looked after the transfer of all our household effects from Hawk Lake to Kenora. And the CPR very graciously supplied me with a boxcar to be able to do that. So, but I would like to just digress a little bit. There's often interest that is shown. Sometimes the subject comes up, and it concerns the beautiful grounds that we had at the CPR station. CPR station was quite kind of a gathering place, you know. Many people would come to the station this was in the days of passenger train service, when we had 4 eastbound daily passengers and 4 westbound daily passengers. And the station grounds were beautiful. I'm sure that maybe some of you, those of you that really didn't see them in actuality, will remember perhaps photographs, postcards that were taken of those station grounds. And the whole idea was this was the responsibility of a former superintendent whose name was Frayne, J.D. Frayne. And he arranged for the greenhouses that grew these flowers to be built next to the shops. Shops always had 2 or 3 engines in them that were being serviced. And so they hooked up the steam engines to the greenhouse. And that was the source of their heat. So year-round, they would be able to grow flowers there. And so, those of you remember that whole north side, the grounds from the Matheson Street Bridge right to the CPR ice house, just adorned with petunias and assortments. People would get off trains and they would walk through the gardens, and sometimes they'd actually delay the train. The conductor would, all aboard! And these people would be running towards the vestibules of the coaches to get on. So, tragically, the floral features of the station grounds disappeared with the disappearance of the steam engine. Whether they would have continued beyond that stage is highly, highly unlikely, because the source of steam was a cheap source of power in order to supply the greenhouses with the heat that they required. There are other things that I could tell you about, folks, but my time has elapsed, and I'd like to thank you all for the attention that you've given me here today, and I hope that some of the things that I've talked about will arouse some interest amongst you. I'm sure that many of you seated there, Kenora having been a major railway center, have family or friends that were engaged in railway activities at some time or another. So thank you once again for your attention.